In the final years of the 19th century, the forests of Oregon seemed endless, a sea of dark pine that swallowed roads and silenced travelers. It was here, at the edge of a hollow where the wind never seemed to stir, that a stranger named Elias Crown arrived. He carried with him no history that locals could trace, no family, no ties, only a practiced politeness that disarmed suspicion. He introduced himself as a carpenter, skilled with wood, willing to build barns or mend fences for fair coin. To farmers who struggled with the harsh seasons, he was a blessing, a quiet man who smiled faintly, never drank, never quarreled, and never demanded more than a modest wage. Yet his eyes lingered too long when they studied faces, as if measuring something invisible beneath the skin. Behind this mask of civility was a mind already twisted by lessons learned in a place far from Oregon. Before the forests, there had been Chicago. Before the cabin, there had been the murder castle of Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Elias had been one of the nameless assistants who helped raise its crooked halls, its hidden chambers and airtight rooms. He had watched, silent and obedient, as Holmes perfected the art of killing under the guise of science and hospitality. What others saw as madness, Elias absorbed as instruction. But unlike Holmes, who thrived on spectacle and greed, Elias found something different in the process. A fascination not with the taking of life, but with the stillness that followed. He became obsessed with the silence that lingered when a body finally gave way. The air heavy, unmoving, as though the world itself had paused to acknowledge the horror. That silence was what he sought to create again, this time in a place untouched by city noise, in a cabin of his own design. He chose the clearing carefully, a pocket of land where the trees seemed unnaturally still, branches stiff even when storms rattled the hills beyond. Locals would later whisper that no breeze ever passed through those pines, that even the grass at the cabin's edge lay flat in eerie stillness. To Elias it was perfect. He began to build with a calm precision, each beam placed with ritual care, each nail driven as though sealing a promise. The design was plain on the outside, a modest single-room dwelling that looked no different from 100 other cabins scattered across the wilderness. But inside, it was a study in control. The walls were double-layered, designed to muffle sound. The windows were narrow, sealed to keep the air heavy. The door was fitted with iron hinges that closed without echo. He wanted no draft, no creak, no whisper of the outside world to enter. He wanted a chamber where silence could be absolute, where suffering could unfold without witness, and where his experiments could continue what Holmes had started. At first, he tested his design on small things, birds captured from the forest, held in boxes where air was slowly drained until their bodies convulsed and then collapsed into stillness. Rabbits tethered in cages, their cries fading into silence as he studied the way their bodies stiffened. Each experiment was written down in a small leather notebook, his handwriting neat, almost delicate, as though he were documenting discoveries of great beauty rather than acts of cruelty. He measured the seconds it took for a sparrow to cease moving, the way its chest rose and fell before stopping, and he compared these figures against the weight of air, the thickness of wood, the density of silence. To Elias, this was not killing. This was study, ritual, and above all, order. And when the first traveler knocked on his door, asking for shelter from the cold, Elias smiled with the same politeness he always carried, stepping aside as though offering kindness. The locals who met him at the trading post would remember only his quiet demeanor, the way he tipped his hat, the way he asked after their families, though he had none of his own. They could not have imagined that within his cabin the first true experiment on human breath had already begun. And outside the forest remained motionless, the trees stiff as though they too were holding their breath, waiting for what was yet to come. Elias Crown became known quickly in the small settlements that dotted the Oregon wilderness. He never announced himself loudly, never pressed his services, but always seemed to appear where he was needed. A barn roof sagging under rain, a fence leaning into rot, a door swollen against its frame. Elias offered help with a soft smile and a voice so calm it never seemed to rise above a whisper. He took no liquor, carried no weapon, and when thanked he bowed his head with a quiet modesty that disarmed suspicion. Families welcomed him, sometimes feeding him at their tables, believing him a lonely but harmless carpenter. Children waved at him as he passed on horseback, and mothers praised his gentle manners. No one saw the notebook he kept tucked under his coat. No one asked about the nights when he returned alone to his cabin, where politeness slipped away, and the truth of his obsession took form in wood and iron. Inside, the cabin was not the plain one-room dwelling its outside suggested. Elias built partitions that divided the interior into narrow chambers, each carefully measured and sealed. He drew on memories of Holmes's murder castle, but where Holmes favored confusion and trickery, Elias sought precision and ritual. Each room was meant to serve a single purpose, each wall reinforced to hold not just bodies but silence itself. He worked at night with lanterns dimmed low, carving beams and smoothing floorboards with care more suited to a church than a prison. What he was building was not a home. It was a shrine to the science of suffering, a place where human life could be bent, tested, and broken without interruption from the world outside. The first chamber was simple, a square space lined with thick boards that let in no draft. The air could be siphoned slowly through a system of vents that Elias controlled with weighted pulleys. He called it the suffocation room, though to him it was not about death but about control. He believed that by managing breath he could measure the exact moment the soul released itself. He sketched diagrams of lungs in his notebook, marking where silence entered as the chest ceased to rise. It was his way of stealing what God had claimed as his own mystery. The second chamber was darker, more deceptive in its cruelty. It contained no water, no river, no well, yet Elias called it his drowning room. A series of pipes ran overhead, releasing a slow, endless drip onto the stone floor. Victims would sit in darkness as the sound of dripping surrounded them, convincing the mind that rising water was closing in. Elias tested the acoustics with his own body first, lying in the chamber for hours, timing how long it took before his heart raced and his skin chilled with phantom wetness. He believed the mind could be drowned by suggestion, that panic itself could choke the breath more effectively than a river. He planned to refine it until terror itself became the killer. The third chamber was the most complex, a place Elias considered his masterpiece. He called it the bone room. Here he built a frame of iron and wood that could bind a body into unnatural positions. Slowly, through the careful tightening of screws and ropes, bones would bend and then crack, not with sudden violence, but with the groaning sound of wood splintering under pressure. Elias believed the body's architecture mirrored the structures he worked with in carpentry. He recorded each experiment as though logging the durability of beams, noting how much pressure a rib could take before it snapped, how long a spine resisted before collapsing. To him, these were not acts of torture. They were blueprints, evidence that flesh and bone followed laws just as certain as timber and stone. What made Elias more dangerous than Holmes was not ambition for wealth or fame, but the belief that his cruelty was study. Where Holmes chased profit, Elias pursued silence, ritual, and perfection. His victims were not nameless wanderers to be disposed of in haste. They were subjects, chosen carefully, kept long enough to observe, broken with method rather than frenzy. Every experiment tightened his grip on the idea that he was not a killer but a craftsman shaping silence itself. To the people outside, Elias remained the same modest carpenter, nodding politely at Sunday gatherings, offering to mend a roof for a widow who could not pay. No one suspected that beneath his steady smile was a mind planning which family would trust him next, which lonely traveler would accept his invitation, which body would be pressed against the walls of his chambers until silence claimed them. Each act of kindness was a mask, a shield that hid the rituals waiting within the cabin where no wind blew and no scream was ever meant to leave. The first true subject came not by force but by circumstance, as if fate itself had delivered a sacrifice to the silent cabin. It was late autumn of 1899 when a traveling peddler wandered into the Oregon woods with a mule-drawn cart of goods he hoped to sell before winter sealed the roads. The sky had blackened with storm, and sheets of rain beat against the earth so heavily that even the trees seemed to bend beneath its weight. The man saw the faint orange glow of a lantern through the branches and made his way to the cabin where Elias Crown stood waiting at the door, calm and dry as though he had known the peddler would arrive. With polite words and a bow of his head, Elias invited the man inside, offering warmth and shelter from the night. The cabin's interior seemed plain, a simple fire burning low, a chair pulled close, a meal already prepared as if in anticipation. The peddler, weary and drenched, accepted with gratitude, seeing in Elias only kindness. He noticed nothing unusual in the silence of the cabin, the way the fire seemed to roar without echo, the way his own footsteps fell heavy but dull against the floorboards. For Elias, this was not chance but design. He had waited for such a moment, testing his chambers with animals, refining his pulleys, adjusting his vents, until he believed he had built a perfect coffin of silence. Now he required only the body of a man to prove it. When the peddler fell asleep on the chair near the fire, Elias moved with a precision that revealed long rehearsals. He bound the man's wrists and ankles, not with crude rope, but with leather straps crafted from animal hide, tightened so neatly they left no room for movement. The peddler awoke to darkness, carried in silence into the hidden chamber. There Elias placed him in the device he had crafted, a coffin-shaped box lined with smooth wood, no sharper edge than that of a coffin in a church. The lid closed without slam or creak, locking him inside. To the peddler it seemed an inexplicable nightmare, sudden and absolute. To Elias it was a moment of calm clarity, the beginning of the silence he longed to master. The coffin was no simple trap. Elias had designed it as a vessel of air and pressure, a chamber where life itself could be drawn out like liquid through a straw. Weighted pulleys were connected to hidden vents, each rope cut to exact length, each stone marked with numbers he had carved into them. By shifting the weights, air was siphoned from the coffin in small, measured increments. It was not sudden suffocation, but a gradual tightening of the lungs, forcing the victim to fight harder for every breath as the air thinned. The peddler gasped, screamed, clawed, but his fists struck only smooth boards. The sound carried no farther than the chamber itself, swallowed by the thick walls Elias had built. Elias sat nearby with his leather notebook open, a sharpened pencil poised in his hand. He recorded each change with neat precision, the time between breaths, the way the man's voice broke into sobs, the rhythm of his fists slowing as weakness overcame him. He wrote that the lungs behaved like bellows collapsing, the chest heaving like wood pressed too tightly. He noted when the screams turned to whimpers, when the whimpers turned to silence. He was not moved by pity or fear, but by fascination, his head tilting slightly as he listened, as though attending a piece of music no one else could hear. The peddler lasted longer than Elias expected. He kicked until his ankles split against the straps, his throat tore from screaming, his eyes swelled with burst vessels. Elias leaned close to the box, pressing his ear against the wood, listening to the final rattles of breath with a serenity that bordered on worship. When the last exhale escaped, it seemed to Elias that the cabin itself grew heavier, the silence pressing against the walls as though the man's final breath had been absorbed into the room. He wrote in his notebook, "Air withdrawn at intervals of 42 seconds. Silence achieved at 1 hour 24 minutes. Subject ceased resistance at final mark." When he opened the coffin, the peddler's face was frozen in horror. His mouth stretched wide as though reaching for air that never came. There were no marks, no bruises, no evidence of struggle beyond the burst eyes and the clawed fingertips. To Elias, this was perfection, a death clean of evidence, leaving behind only the silence he had sought. He dragged the body to a pit beneath the cabin floor, arranging it with a careful order, folding the arms across the chest, closing the mouth by hand until the features were still. Above, he recorded another entry, silence confirmed. Subject placed beneath floor for continued observation. The storm outside raged into the night, but within the cabin no sound stirred. The forest remained still, the trees unmoving. Elias sat by the fire once more, notebook on his lap, face calm and expressionless. To the outside world he was still the soft-spoken carpenter, the polite helper who asked for nothing in return. But in truth he had already crossed the threshold Holmes had opened for him, refining cruelty into ritual, turning death into study. The first subject was gone, and with him, Elias had proven what he always believed. Silence could be shaped like wood, bent like bone, and captured forever inside the cabin where the wind never blew. Elias Crown's fascination with silence soon grew into something larger than the containment of breath. Killing the traveling peddler had not satisfied him. It had only opened a deeper hunger. He began searching for knowledge that would allow him to shape death as though it were a science, to transform cruelty into something that looked like order and healing. In an old trunk he had carried from the East, he kept several medical books, most of them stolen from Chicago when he abandoned the shadow of homes. One in particular he returned to again and again. The writings of Dr. Benjamin Rush, celebrated as a founder of American psychiatry. Rush had believed that madness came from imbalance, that it could be purged through bleeding, blistering, or forced vomiting. Where others saw outdated cruelty, Elias saw scripture. To him, Rush had not been a primitive physician, but a prophet who understood that pain itself could wash a soul clean. In the quiet of the cabin, Elias copied passages into his leather notebook, underlining words like purge, release, and cure. He began to construct what he called ritual chairs, heavy wooden seats built with straps of leather and iron, carved by his own hand with symbols he believed gave the acts weight and purpose. Each chair was designed to hold a body in stillness, to turn the human form into something like a patient in a clinic. But his medicine was not meant to heal. It was meant to study how far a soul could be stretched before breaking. His first victim after the peddler was a wandering logger who had drunk himself unconscious by the roadside. Elias offered him shelter, lifting him with false care, carrying him as though to safety. When the man awoke, he found himself bound to the ritual chair, his arms lashed tight, his chest exposed. Elias worked calmly with the steadiness of a physician preparing for surgery. He did not scream at his victim or strike him with anger. Instead, he spoke in a voice so soft it seemed almost kind, explaining that the body carried humors that spoiled the mind, that they could be let out like poisoned air through careful cuts. Then, with a blade honed to a carpenter's edge, Elias began carving into the man's chest and arms, not slashing wildly, but cutting in neat, deliberate patterns. Thin rivulets of blood traced the shapes he drew, forming spirals, grids, and lattices across skin as though he were mapping invisible currents beneath the flesh. The logger screamed until his throat broke, then whimpered, then sobbed. Elias wrote each reaction down with patient detail. He believed the body's panic was evidence of humors being released. When the man fainted from blood loss, Elias revived him with icy water and resumed the process, forcing him to endure longer than nature intended. Hours passed before the life drained completely. The body slumped in the chair, blood pooled in patterns that darkened the wood. Elias sat back and observed with a strange satisfaction, as though admiring a finished piece of work. He marked the notebook. Spirals more effective than lines. Release achieved in 6 hours, 42 minutes. The next subject was a young woman who had come to the settlement searching for her missing brother. Elias welcomed her with polite words and warm food, telling her he would help with her search. That night she too was bound to a ritual chair, her wrists fixed to armrests carved with notches that held her veins exposed. Elias altered his method, cutting smaller lines across her legs and arms, believing that more channels meant more purging. Her cries filled the chamber, yet beyond the thickened walls of the cabin the world remained still, the forest silent as though listening. Elias worked with calm focus, moving the blade as if drawing diagrams for some unseen audience. He was not frantic. He was not sadistic in the way others might think. To him, this was medicine, a ritual purification where her pain served a higher order. When she finally stilled, her body pale and emptied, Elias recorded in his notebook. Smaller cuts prolong release. Soul departs without sound. Silence remains complete. The deaths began to accumulate beneath the floorboards. Each body he arranged with careful ritual, folding arms across chests, carving final marks into skin that he believed would guide the spirit into silence. He no longer thought of himself as a murderer, but as a kind of doctor-priest, practicing the cures others were too afraid to attempt. The psychology of his evil was that it wore the mask of civility. He smiled at neighbors, fixed their fences, and asked after their children with gentle concern. They saw only a quiet carpenter, never knowing that the same hands smoothing their door frames were also carving spirals into human skin in the dead of night. Elias believed he was balancing the world one subject at a time. With each death, the silence in the cabin grew thicker, heavier, more absolute. He imagined that if he continued, he could one day quiet the entire forest, maybe even silence the wind itself. And so he pressed forward, methodical and tireless, confident that the ritual of pain was his true calling. He did not know, or perhaps did not care, that his own soul was the only one growing darker, sinking deeper into the silence he worshipped. The disappearance of the three sisters began as an absence no one could explain. They were daughters of a poor settler family who lived close to the river, known for gathering reeds and selling woven baskets at the market. On a cold evening, they did not return home, and though neighbors assumed they had simply stayed with kin, whispers soon rose when no trace of them appeared the next morning. Their mother's grief echoed in the settlement, but Elias Crown's face showed only quiet sympathy as he offered to help with the search. Behind his measured words and bowed head, he already knew where they were, for they had walked willingly into the woods with him the night before, believing his promise of shelter until the storm passed. Inside the cabin, Elias had prepared a new chamber. Unlike the suffocation box or the ritual chair, this room was built not to break the body quickly, but to dissolve the mind slowly. He had studied the sound of dripping water, testing it by suspending buckets above stone, listening to the endless rhythm until even he felt his thoughts unravel. He knew the human ear could not ignore repetition, that the sound would become unbearable over hours, over days. He called it the drowning that never ends, for though no flood would rise, the mind itself would believe it was sinking. Into this chamber he led the sisters, locking the heavy door behind them, sealing away their voices from the world outside. The room was black except for a faint lamp Elias extinguished once they were bound. Their hands were tied loosely, their feet shackled just enough to keep them from fleeing. Above, water dripped from a pipe he had set into the ceiling, a slow, relentless beat against the stone floor. At first the sisters whispered comfort to each other, promising it was only for a night. But soon the sound filled every pause between words until their speech fell quiet, replaced only by the steady dripping that seemed to mark time itself. When they closed their eyes, the rhythm continued. When they tried to sleep, the sound shook them awake. By the second day, their lips cracked with thirst, their tongues heavy. Elias entered then, calm and expressionless, carrying a wooden bowl filled with liquid dark as rust. He told them gently that this was their baptism, a drink that would cleanse them and prepare them for silence. Inside the bowl was water drawn from the river mixed with blood he had drained from earlier victims. The sisters resisted, but thirst overpowered them. He pressed the bowl to their mouths until they swallowed, gagging at the taste, their bodies shaking in disgust. To Elias, their revulsion was proof of the ritual's strength. He believed that by forcing the body to accept what the soul feared, he was binding them to silence itself. Hours turned into days. Their eyes grew wide and hollow, their hair tangled, their skin pale with exhaustion. They clawed at the floor and walls, begging for the dripping to stop, but Elias never yielded. He sat outside with his notebook, timing their cries, noting the patterns of their madness. One sister began laughing uncontrollably at nothing. Another rocked back and forth until her chains rattled without pause. The youngest fell silent, curling against the floor as though shrinking into herself. Elias called this the final stage, the drowning of the mind where fear no longer resisted but sank quietly into the dark. When their bodies finally collapsed, they did so not with the violence of his earlier experiments, but with a slow fading, each one slipping away as though into deep water. Elias watched them die without expression, writing with neat letters that silence had been achieved through ritual drowning without a single drop of rising flood. To him, this was victory, the proof that death could be engineered through suggestion alone. He dragged their corpses beneath the cabin floor, arranging them not in careless burial, but in deliberate patterns. Their bones, once stripped, were placed in circles and crosses, designs he had copied from old folk charms. He believed the shapes would trap the silence in place, ensuring that no whisper of their suffering could escape. The forest outside remained still, the air unmoving as though the trees themselves bowed to the ritual. In the settlement, their mother wept for daughters who had simply vanished, while Elias Crown offered her words of comfort in the same voice that had ordered them to drink blood in the dark. His mask of innocence never slipped, and no one knew that beneath his cabin the daughters of the river were arranged like symbols, their silence made eternal. The disappearance of the three sisters left the settlement unsettled, a wound that deepened with every unanswered question. Their mother's cries carried through the small community, and while neighbors searched the river banks and ravines, whispers began to rise that something unnatural was happening in the woods. A local physician, Dr. Abram Lorne, took particular interest. He was a practical man trained in Philadelphia before drifting west to serve rural families where no other doctors would go. His reputation was one of patience and reason, and when others gave themselves over to superstition, he relied on examination and evidence. But it was precisely that reliance on logic that Elias Crown intended to exploit. When the physician's suspicions turned toward him, Elias invited it. He prepared his cabin for another ritual, one he had been designing for weeks, the instrument he called the spinal harp. Elias staged his deception with meticulous calm. He visited the settlement one evening, moving slower than usual, his complexion paler than the neighbors remembered, his voice quieter still. When asked if he was well, he pressed a hand against his side and admitted that he had been feeling faint, dizzy, unable to work. His show was convincing, and within days Dr. Lorne came to his cabin carrying his satchel of tools, ready to examine what he thought was an illness. Elias greeted him with gratitude, leading him into the quiet room where the fire burned low. The doctor noticed the air was heavy, thick, as though it held more weight than it should, but said nothing. He set down his satchel, expecting to take a pulse or prescribe a tonic. He never saw the straps until they were already fastened. The spinal harp stood in a separate chamber, a creation born from Elias's obsession with both carpentry and anatomy. It resembled a wooden frame, wide at the base and narrowing at the top, with a seat carved into its lower half. From the frame extended cords of twisted gut, tightened and fixed with pegs like those of a stringed instrument. But these were not strings meant to be played by hand. They were meant to be bound to the body itself. Elias forced the physician onto the seat, securing his wrists and ankles with iron clasps. The man struggled, demanding answers, but Elias's calm voice assured him this was not punishment but study. Then, with a precision learned through weeks of secret practice, he drove hooked pins into points along the doctor's back, shoulders and thighs, threading the tendons into the frame. The pain was immediate, the screams raw and animal. But Elias did not flinch. He adjusted the tension with a craftsman's eye, pulling the cords until the doctor's body arched against the frame. Each pull tightened the muscles, stretched the nerves, and transformed the living body into an instrument of convulsion. With a carved wooden pick, Elias began plucking the tightened lines, watching the spasms ripple through his victim's flesh. The body jerked violently, twisting against itself, the sound of strained breath and tearing tissue filling the sealed chamber. Elias listened carefully, not to the cries, but to the rhythm of the convulsions. To him, the spasms were notes, the body playing itself in a composition only he could appreciate. He recorded every detail in his notebook, his handwriting neat, almost elegant. He wrote of how certain tendons produced sharper movements, how the stretching of the spine produced shuddering that lasted longer than the plucking of the arms. He noted that the body's resistance waned after repeated tension, the convulsions weakening as exhaustion set in. He described the doctor's face as it contorted, first in fury, then in desperation, then finally in a mask of hopelessness. Elias did not rush. He plucked each line carefully, allowing silence to fall between each spasm as though savoring the spaces between sounds. The physician's cries eventually broke into gasps, his throat raw, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had lived his life as a man of science, and now he found himself reduced to a specimen in another's cruel experiment. The psychological toll was evident. Rage at first, then confusion, then despair. He begged for reason, for understanding. But Elias remained detached, the pencil scratching across the page, the calm expression never shifting. Elias believed he was proving something greater than cruelty. He believed he was showing that the body was an instrument of silence, that pain could be tuned like music, that spasms could be mapped like scales. After hours of torment, the doctor's body gave way. The tendons frayed, the muscles tore, and the frame held only a slack form that no longer convulsed. Elias released the cords with deliberate slowness, watching as the body slumped forward, lifeless. He cleaned his tools with the same care a physician might show after surgery, then closed the notebook with satisfaction. The entry was detailed, clinical, free of any sign that this had been a man he had known or spoken with. To Elias, doctor, Lorne had never been a neighbor or a healer. He had been only a subject, another step toward mastering silence. Beneath the cabin floor, the physician's remains joined those of the others. But unlike the sisters, whose bones were arranged in patterns, Elias left the doctor's frame intact, still bound with cords, preserved as though the experiment might one day be repeated. The silence in the cabin grew heavier that night, pressing against the walls, filling the air with a weight that no storm could move. Outside, the forest remained still, the trees stiff as though frozen mid-breath. In the settlement, the mother of the sisters wept anew, and neighbors wondered where the physician had gone. Elias Crown only smiled softly when asked, promising to help in the search. His mask of innocence held firm even as the notebook beside his bed contained pages of notes that treated human agony as nothing more than discovery. By the time the physician's body had gone cold in the chamber, Elias Crown's obsession had shifted once again. The suffocation box, the drowning chamber, even the spinal harp. Each had proven that silence could be carved from suffering, that breath and body could be manipulated into stillness. But Elias was no longer satisfied with studying the science of death. Now he wanted to shape it into ritual, into ceremony. He wanted to strip the act of all noise, to craft not only silence but submission. What began as an experiment was becoming liturgy, and his victims were no longer subjects but offerings. He found his medium in the birch trees that grew pale and slender on the edge of the forest. Their bark peeled easily, their wood soft enough to carve, and he spent long nights shaping thin sheets into crude masks. They were featureless, smooth as bone, with only small openings cut for the eyes. To Elias, the birch represented purity, a blankness he could impose upon the human face. He believed that if he covered his victims with these masks and sealed their mouths, their final moments would not be wasted in screams. They would die in a silence so absolute that it would change the air itself. The first test of this new ritual was a young man who had been traveling west in search of work. He accepted Elias's invitation with gratitude, never sensing the danger behind the soft smile. Bound to the chair, his face was fitted with the birch mask, the wood pressed against his skin, cool and unyielding. Elias melted wax over the man's lips, pouring it carefully, letting it harden into a seal that held the mouth shut. The victim thrashed in panic, his eyes darting wildly through the small openings of the mask. He tried to scream, but no sound came, only muffled gasps trapped in his throat. Elias sat close, watching intently, his hands steady, his breathing calm. He recorded the time it took for the man's chest to rise frantically, then falter, then stop. When the body sagged, he wrote in his notebook, "Choir completed, silence perfect." But Elias did not stop there. He began to refine the ritual, adding detail, making each death slower, more deliberate. He believed that the silence of one victim was powerful, but the silence of many layered together could still the world itself. He arranged multiple chairs in the chamber, bringing in victims one by one, travelers, drifters, anyone who trusted his gentle manner. Each was masked, each sealed with wax, and each forced to suffocate while their eyes watched others share the same fate. Their chests heaved in unison, their bodies convulsed in a rhythm Elias likened to music. He called them his choirs of silence, convinced that with every muffled gasp and every final stillness, the air outside his cabin grew heavier, the trees more rigid, the wind more absent. The psychological toll on his victims was devastating. The mask denied them individuality, reducing them to faceless forms awaiting suffocation. The wax denied them the basic release of screaming, forcing their terror inward, suffocating not only lungs but spirit. They died staring at each other, unable to speak, unable to beg, their panic reflected in the wide, glassy eyes of those who followed. The chamber became a theater of silent suffering, where every death was both a performance and a sacrifice. For Elias, each ritual confirmed his delusion. He began to believe he was not killing, but transforming. He convinced himself that the victims were leaving behind their noise, their imperfections, and becoming part of a greater stillness that he alone could hear. He spent hours after their deaths arranging the masks on the walls, hanging them like icons in a church. The faces of birchwood looked down upon him as he wrote, their hollow eyes bearing witness to his madness. He spoke softly to them, telling them they had given their breath to the silence, and in return the silence would hold them forever. Outside the cabin, the natural world seemed to respond. Neighbors noticed how the clearing never stirred, even when storms rolled across the hills. Smoke rose from the chimney without drifting, hanging like a column above the roof. The grass lay flat, the branches rigid. Children whispered that the forest there did not breathe. The settlers avoided the path, though none dared accuse Elias directly, for he still appeared in their lives with the same calm demeanor, repairing their roofs, asking after their health, bowing his head with humility. No one could reconcile the gentle carpenter with the dread that settled in the woods around his home. Inside, however, the rituals deepened. Elias no longer needed to justify himself as a scientist or a healer. He had become a priest of silence, convinced that every wax-sealed mouth and every birch mask strengthened the hold of stillness over the world. His notebook filled with sketches of lungs trapped in cages, diagrams of faces sealed forever, records of times and spasms written with cold precision. He believed that one day, if the choirs grew large enough, he could quiet not just the forest but the earth itself. And so he continued, each victim another voice stripped away, each mask another symbol on his walls. He waited patiently for the next wanderer, the next settler, the next child who might trust his smile. For Elias Crown, perfection was no longer in secrecy. It was in the choir, the ritual, the suffocating silence that grew with every death, holding the cabin, the trees, and the very wind itself in unnatural stillness. The forest around Elias Crown's cabin had grown heavier with every passing season, and though neighbors did not speak openly, the unease was spreading like rot beneath the bark of the settlement. Too many had vanished along the road, too many families were left with empty chairs at their tables. A peddler, a doctor, 3 sisters, a hired hand, each disappearance might have been explained on its own. But together they formed a pattern, one the locals could not ignore. Whispers carried across firelit rooms at night. The woods were cursed, the river was swallowing people whole. Or perhaps some darker hand was guiding it all. Yet when they looked to Elias Crown, the quiet carpenter who asked for nothing and helped with everything, they saw only a gentle smile and the bow of a head. He still fixed doors, still split wood for widows, still asked after children with a voice soft as silk, his mask of innocence held. But suspicion has a way of finding cracks, and it was a young widow who would be the first to see through his veil. Her name had been whispered already, a woman whose husband had drowned the previous winter, leaving her alone in a house that creaked with silence. She carried grief like a shadow, but also courage sharpened by loss. On a late evening, while searching for her missing nephew, she strayed into the part of the woods where the trees seemed unnaturally stiff, their branches unmoving even as clouds gathered overhead. That was when she heard it. Faint, distant, a sound that did not belong. It was not the cry of an animal, nor the shifting of branches. It was human, fragile, like a muffled gasp carried on no wind. Drawn by equal measures of terror and resolve, she followed it deeper into the trees until she reached the clearing. The sight stopped her breath. The grass around the cabin lay flat as if pressed by unseen hands. The smoke rising from its chimney climbed straight into the sky without sway, and the air itself felt as though it refused to move. She realized then that the sound she had followed was gone, replaced only by the pounding of her own breath in her ears. Fear told her to turn back, but grief pushed her forward. She stepped across the threshold, and the silence wrapped around her like a second skin. Inside, the air smelled of salt and something fouler, sweet and rotting beneath it. Her eyes adjusted to the dim glow of a single lamp, and what she saw locked her body in place. Against the walls, corpses stood upright, strung with wires and hooks, their skin preserved in thick coats of salt that glittered in the weak light. They were arranged like saints in a chapel, their heads bowed, their arms stiff at their sides. The wax seals over their mouths had not melted. The birch masks still clung to some faces, their hollow eyes staring outward. It was not just death. It was ceremony, a gallery of silence Elias had built, each victim displayed as though part of a holy procession. The widow's stomach turned as her eyes moved from one preserved figure to another. Some she recognized from memory. The doctor with his kind eyes, a girl from the settlement with her hair still braided, a traveler whose body now hung slack in a faceless mask. The salt had stiffened their features, but the horror in their eyes remained locked forever in glassy silence. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming, and in that moment realized that even her own breath sounded too loud in this place. The psychological toll crushed her as she stumbled backward, her heart hammering against ribs that felt too small for it. Every instinct told her she was not alone, that Elias might be watching from the shadows, calm and smiling, ready to add her to his choir. She forced her legs to move, tearing herself from the cabin and into the lifeless clearing. Only when she reached the edge of the forest and felt the wind stir against her face did she finally collapse. Gasping, her body shaking as though it too had been bound to one of his cruel inventions. By morning she brought her story to the settlement. Though some dismissed her as broken by grief, the sheriff could not ignore the details. A small band of men armed themselves and followed her into the woods. The cabin stood waiting, still and quiet, just as she had described. They burst inside with rifles raised, expecting resistance, but what they found was worse than violence. The rooms were stripped bare. The salt-preserved corpses were gone, the masks removed from the walls, the ritual chairs dismantled. Only the faint smell of wax lingered in the air, and beneath the floorboards the soil was freshly disturbed as though bodies had been dragged out in haste. Elias Crown was nowhere to be found. No footprints led away, no sign of struggle marked the ground. It was as if he had dissolved into the still air itself, carried not by wind but by silence. The sheriff ordered the cabin torn apart, Its beams burned in a pyre. But even as the flames consumed the wood, the men swore they felt the air press against them heavy, refusing to move. When the smoke rose, it climbed straight into the sky without sway, just as before. The widow stood apart, watching with hollow eyes. She knew the fire would not erase what she had seen. She knew that Elias Crown had not been caught, that somewhere he still walked, polite and calm, carrying his silence with him. The others wanted to believe the horror was finished, but she carried the truth. Evil that wears a mask of innocence never ends with fire. It waits, patient, methodical, hidden in the spaces where no wind dares to blow. For decades the cabin remained, even after the sheriff's men had sworn they had burned it to ash. In the clearing where the trees refused to sway, charred beams blackened the soil. But the skeleton of the house never seemed to vanish completely. A frame of scorched wood lingered upright against all storms, as though the silence itself had preserved it. Travelers who stumbled across the ruins spoke of the way sound seemed to die in their throats there, how even the crunch of footsteps on pine needles dulled to nothing. They told of a heaviness that settled on their lungs, as if the air was not meant to be drawn, as if they were breathing the last exhalations of others. It was said that those who lingered too long heard whispers in the walls, ragged breaths rising and falling just out of reach. Farmers from nearby lands claimed their livestock would sometimes wander toward the clearing and not return. When the animals were found, they were discovered stiff and pale, bodies drained of fluid with cuts so precise they looked more like surgical practice than predator attack. Horses were found with tendons sliced clean, cattle with organs removed as though studied, sheep with their blood collected in neat depressions in the earth. Some said these were signs that Crown had never left, that he still worked in secret, slipping back to the ruin to perfect his rituals on beasts when people grew too wary. The wounds were recorded in journals of the time, described as methodical, ritualistic, and chilling in their order. Stories of Elias Crown spread far beyond Oregon. Settlers carried the tales westward into Washington and Montana, where disappearances along isolated trails were whispered about in the same breath as his name. Miners in Montana spoke of men who vanished from camps, only for their bodies to be found weeks later, placed upright in shallow shafts with their mouths sealed shut. In Washington, loggers told of cabins abandoned with strange carvings burned into their walls. Circles, spirals, and shapes that matched the symbols once described by the widow who had fled Crown's chamber of salt. The pattern of horror stretched like a shadow across the northern states, too broad to be denied, yet too elusive to be captured. Some newspapers called him America's second Holmes, linking him to the legacy of the doctor who had raised the murder castle in Chicago. But even those comparisons felt inadequate, for where Holmes had built a labyrinth of greed and spectacle, Crown worked with quiet ritual, his violence shaped not by profit but by obsession. The press painted him as a ghoul, a traveling physician of pain who carried silence with him like a shroud. But among those who whispered in the dark, another belief took hold: that Elias Crown was no longer entirely human. There were those who swore he had mastered what he sought, that silence itself had become his ally. They said he could move unseen because sound betrayed no trace of him, that doors closed without creak at his touch. that the forest around him grew still when he passed. Some believed the cabin had not burned because it could not, that the souls he had sealed with wax and birch masks had bound the walls into permanence. Others whispered that he had become part of the silence itself, no longer a man but a shadow that waited wherever sound should be. Children were warned not to wander into quiet woods. Mothers pressed their ears to their children's chests at night to be sure breath still stirred. His name became less of a man and more of a superstition. The legacy of his cruelty was not only in fear but in the slow decay it left on those who remembered. Families broken by vanishings lived with holes that never healed. Whole communities shrinking from the woods as though the trees themselves held judgment. Men who claimed to have walked into the ruin of the cabin returned changed. Some struck mute, others plagued by coughing that no doctor could explain. They said the silence of the place had clung to their lungs, smothering them from within. And even as years passed, as generations turned, the clearing remained a place avoided, a wound in the forest. Yet Crown himself was never seen again in any form that could be proven. No trial, no capture, no confession was recorded. Only fragments of stories, only bodies drained and arranged, only silence heavier than the wind could explain. His notebook was said to have survived, carried in secret by men too afraid to publish its contents. Those who glimpsed its pages described sketches of lungs in cages, diagrams of spines wired to wooden frames, drawings of masked faces with eyes wide and hollow. The notes were not frantic but clinical, as though suffering had been reduced to simple observation. If the book was real, it was never produced publicly, as though the silence Crown worshipped had swallowed even the record of his work. In the end, his legacy was not only in the deaths themselves, but in the idea that evil could exist in such calm disguise. He had smiled at neighbors, bowed his head, offered help to those in need, and all the while he had been perfecting chambers of horror that no storm could ever expose. The cabin stood as the proof, defying weather and fire, holding inside it the suffocating breath of the forgotten. The wind never blew in that clearing, and some believed it never would again. Elias Crown had achieved what he desired, silence that outlived him, silence that still clung to the earth decades later, silence that made the world itself hold its breath. Evil does not always arrive with a roar. More often it comes dressed in gentleness, wearing the mask of modesty, offering help when no one else will. Elias Crown was not remembered in the settlement as a monster when he lived among them. He was remembered as the quiet carpenter who bowed his head, who built fences and mended barns, who asked after widows and tipped his hat at children. No one saw the ritual chairs beneath his cabin, the birch masks that stripped faces of voice, or the preserved corpses strung like saints in the silence of salt. No one imagined that the politeness they welcomed into their homes was only a shield for ritual cruelty. His charm was not bright or dazzling, it was soft, like a lull before suffocation. It was this softness that made his horror possible. After his disappearance, debates began far from Oregon in cities where doctors and lawmakers tried to make sense of cruelty disguised as science. The fragments of his notebooks that surfaced, whether real or forgeries, spoke of lungs collapsing, nerves stretched into spasms, silence arranged like music. They were studied in medical circles as examples of why suffering cannot be dressed as progress. Some whispered that the pages influenced new limits placed on experiments within asylums and prisons, where vulnerable bodies had too often been used as tools for knowledge. Legislators argued over whether restraint should be banned, whether bleeding and purging, once defended as medicine, were in truth nothing more than echoes of the same delusion Crown had worshipped. His methods were never legitimized, but their memory shaped the ethics of future generations. Even horror leaves lessons. Yet in Oregon the wound remained. For decades the site of the cabin was avoided, its clearing left untouched, the trees still refusing to sway even when storms shook the hills. No family settled near it, no crops grew willingly in the soil. Finally, in the early 20th century, the community erected a memorial there. Not for Elias Crown, but for those who had vanished into silence. It was simple, a stone marker with no names, for no whole bodies had ever been found to claim or bury. Families brought flowers, leaving them at the base of the stone, watching as the petals withered faster than they should in the still air. It was said that prayers spoken there never carried, that words seemed to fall flat as though the silence had claimed even memory. The marker stood less as comfort than as warning, a reminder of how easily evil can root itself when hidden behind innocence. Those who studied Crown in later years argued over what he truly was. Some insisted he was nothing more than a human monster, a student of homes who carried cruelty to new perfection. Others believed the silence he conjured could not be explained by man alone, that he had tapped into something supernatural, something that made the wind itself obey. But perhaps the truth was simpler and more terrible. Perhaps silence was not conjured but enforced by the politeness of a society unwilling to see him for what he was. Neighbors had looked into his calm eyes, had shaken his hand, had welcomed him to their tables. Their trust, their reluctance to question a man who seemed so harmless became the very silence that protected him. Evil thrives in that hesitation. It does not need power or weapons when it has patience, when it has masks of normalcy. Elias Crown proved that monstrosity can live in plain sight, disguised as humility, performing horrors while the world turns away. His legacy was not only in the victims who perished within his cabin, but in the silence that surrounded him while he lived. The silence of neighbors too polite to suspect, of communities too cautious to accuse, of a society that mistook gentleness for virtue. That silence became his weapon, sharper than any blade, heavier than any rope. Today the memorial still stands in the clearing, weathered but unbroken. The wind does not stir there, just as it never did when Crown lived. Travelers who stumble upon it speak of a weight in their lungs, as if drawing breath costs more than it should. Some say the silence is his true grave, that every victim remains suspended within it, that Elias Crown himself lingers there, polite and patient, waiting for another who will trust him. His name has faded into folklore, yet the lessons of his cruelty remain alive in laws, in debates, in the unspoken recognition that suffering can be disguised as treatment, that monsters can wear smiles. And so the question falls not on the past but on the present. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could a man of soft words and gentle manners, a man who tips his hat and offers his hand, still build chambers of horror while the world refuses to see? Could silence once more be shaped into a weapon, not by storms or winds, but by the calm, methodical patience of someone hidden among us? The forest still waits, still stills the air, and the silence Crown worshipped has not yet broken.